much. And thank you for having me here today. I'm going to be talking to you about my PhD research, which is titled Rangering and Resistance. So, Indigenous Women, Structural Barriers, and the Myth of American Wilderness. This study revealed that due to the settler colonial structure of park systems, Indigenous women park rangers face modern-day manifestations of frontier violence. Yet, despite these hostile work environments characterized by gender and race-based challenges, these women actively seek to reclaim and integrate their traditional stories, histories, knowledge, and stewardship practice into their work of resource protection. This research was focused on Indigenous women park rangers, but the information is very applicable to many types of natural resource management workplaces. Before I get into it, I just want to say that I am a little bit struggling with criticizing our Park Service and our public lands, considering the current political climate, and I stand alongside with the park rangers, scientists, and public employees that were illegally fired, many of whom are my friends. But the timing of my research is what it is, and we're just going to continue down this journey. So I'd like to give you just a little bit of positionality just to place myself into where this research is. I am of Cherokee and European ancestry, a citizen of the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. I was a previous park ranger and backcountry emergency medical technician in Colorado for 3 years. And I do have personal experience with gender discrimination, sexual harassment, and assault within the workplace. So this study is very near and dear to my heart. As you can see in this picture, I'm hanging out with my two buddies, Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir. Both were instrumental in the expansion of our national parks, monuments, refuges, and forests within the United States. They did this by protecting large tracts of land by evicting the native populations. As you can tell in their faces, they aren't too keen to be hanging out with a modern day native woman park ranger. Now, I'd like you to think about and just imagine, think back when you last visited a visitor center, and I want you to recall how and where you learned about the native population that lived on the land. Do you remember a placard in the visitor center, maybe depicting a native village or discussing a population's nomadic lifestyle? Maybe it mentioned the prehistoric indigenous communities that used to inhabit the land. Or do you remember how the first white settler crested the mountain or descended into the canyon and discovered this majestic landscape? Eventually, you'll learn when the land was considered important enough to be given protected area status and preserved for future generations. This date is typically celebrated yearly as the park's birthday, with festivities on social media, often with dancing park rangers and birthday hats. After all, the park system is America's best idea. Now I want you to imagine being one of the indigenous park rangers with an understanding of the history of the landscape and knowing that this birthday celebration aligns with the same time when the indigenous people who inhabited these lands since time immemorial were forcibly removed. Oftentimes, these park rangers work on the lands that their ancestors inhabited. Instead of a celebration, for these rangers, this marks the time in history when their own familial colonial trauma occurred. These rangers are living within a system that has attempted to erase their people, their culture, and stories. And yet they are still on their lands. They are telling their stories. They are representing their people. They are continuing their culture, and they are wearing the uniform of the government system that was not able to silence their ancestors. This is what resilience looks like. We're going to talk a bit about the background of the park systems across the United States. It was based on the doctrine of manifest destiny, which is the belief that the expansion of the European settler throughout the American continent was both justified and inevitable. They classified land as wilderness instead of homelands, legally making the land terra nullius, which means land belonging to no one and free to be conquered. This paved the way for epidemics, forced removals, armed conflict, near extinction of bison, and forced assimilation of indigenous peoples. Yet, to this day, we actually have a monument celebrating this legacy. As you can see in the picture, this is the Gateway to the West. It is a national park in St. Louis, Missouri, and it was created as a tribute to the opening of the West by white pioneers. This is done by President Thomas Jefferson and the Lewis and Clark expedition. The National Park Service is considered America's best idea because they set aside the most remarkable landscapes to be preserved, not for the royalty or the rich, but for everyone. But what was the cost of this idea? It was stripping the lands of the people and the cultures that have inhabited and cultivated these spaces. Forceful assimilation by imposing new laws and governance structures into indigenous lands and peoples. We have broken treaties with Native nations, and many of our parks are in a conservation crisis because the Native people were forcibly removed and the land is no longer being managed in union with nature. So the modern day park rangers that are working in these spaces are trying to find a place for the modern indigenous story within these landscapes. We're going to talk a little bit about representation within the parks, but first I would like to start by saying that Native Americans are not a minority. Native Americans are not ethnic population, they're not minority population, not immigrants or people of color. We are the indigenous people of this continent with sovereign nations. Many of us hold dual citizenship between the US and our tribal nations, and this is important to note because it gives Native people a different political status than other minority groups within the country. All that being said, for the literature review, all the background information, and the stats for this presentation, Native Americans have been placed in the category of a minority within the overall population. So we're going to look at these graphs right here. This is park ranger, or I'm sorry, National Park Service employees. And as you can see, Indigenous women are greatly underrepresented within natural resource management and conservation. But as we know, Indigenous women are important keepers of knowledge and land management practices. So if you look at the graph, you see have GS 1 through 7, and it's American Indian and Alaska Native are in green, and then we're also going to use the little blue sliver, which is Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders as well. So you can see the representation here in the lowest class of employees. As it goes up, of course, it gets smaller and smaller. The only position where women are the majority throughout the park, not just Indigenous, but just all women, are the lowest paid and the least powerful. Now, of course, Deb Haaland, who was the previous U.S. Secretary of the Interior, changed this, and she gave Native women a moment to shine in upper leadership. So thank you, Deb Haaland, for the work that she did. Now we're going to look specifically at park rangers. You can see here that Native women park rangers, there were only 34 of them in 2020 compared to the 790 white women park rangers. Native women make up 1.2% of the National Park Service Ranger Corps, and so they're a very, very small portion of the workforce. Now, why these numbers matter. Underrepresentation comes with many challenges, one being identity strain. This is the strain felt by minority employees when they have to manage their cultural, racial, and ethnic identities in order to more effectively meet the norms and expectations of the dominant workplace culture. They also experience cultural load, which is the burden of being the only one or one of the very few Indigenous people within the workplace. So they are expected to be able to represent and speak to the culture of all Indigenous peoples. Okay, I'm going to very quickly talk about my methodologies for this project. I used a two-eyed seeing approach, and this approach was designed by Mi'kmaq Elder Albert Marshall. This approach sees the research through two separate eyes or perspectives. So we have the Western and the Indigenous. And when you look at research through two unique lenses, it allows us to learn through the strengths and ways of knowing from each perspective, and it allows a lot of flexibility within the research design. The most important part of my research design was that I wanted to do it in co-creation with other Indigenous women. So I had 5 women from the research participants that were chosen to be on the Indigenous Advisory Committee. And we meet as talking circles, and these women have actually led the research design. They helped me develop the questions for the interviews. They helped me do member checking of the data. They are going to help with the final presentations and the deliverable development for this project. So I've kind of acted as a guide along this project, but these women have really pushed this research forward. And I do have to say, I feel like I won the PhD lottery because working with Indigenous women park rangers, they're the coolest people on the planet, and it has been an incredible experience to work alongside them. For this project, I interviewed 14 different women who represent 18 tribes and communities and 11 different park systems. The Indigenous Advisory Committee was made up of 5 women from 6 tribes and communities and 5 park systems. And unfortunately, that's all the demographics I can share with you because keeping their identity private and keeping them safe is the top priority. Now, let's get into the story of this research. So, Western management and Indigenous perspectives on natural resource reflect two distinct yet intertwined narratives that intersect across North America. The fundamental differences in these perspectives can be investigated through the lens of what each considers critical infrastructure. Western agencies like the National Park Service aim to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. Whereas the indigenous perspective on land management stem from cultural connections and experiencing natural resources as essential elements of identity, spirituality, and sustenance. The structures of Western management is focused on what the land can provide to the people, whereas the indigenous viewpoint focuses on the interconnected and mutual relationship between land and humans. When looking at the Western management perspective, the founding principle is based on fortress conservation. They use a public trust doctrine, which means the land is held by the government for the people. They consider resources economic assets. They do this through regulations and bans, and they use science-based management. And there are obviously issues with this structure of management. The public trust doctrine is problematic because it is rooted in the settler colonial legacy of indigenous genocide and persecution and was used to legitimize the colonization of North America. The other principles exclude diverse perspective from management policy and practice. The Western approach has completely disregarded indigenous governance systems and knowledge that has sustained wildlife and ecosystems across the North America landscape for millennia. Moving over to the indigenous perspective, resources are considered life forces, not resources. They are our ancestors, living systems with cultural and ecological importance. Typically, the systems use a co-ownership and group governance structure with collective decision making. They prioritize communal lands over market-based individual ownership and use traditional ecological knowledge, which is based on a deep understanding of the natural environment and utilizes an ecosystem management approach. If you are a modern day Native women park ranger or forester, you are navigating the delicate balance of working within Western natural resource management agencies while upholding traditional spiritual practices and cultural values to protect the land. Now that we understand the history of the park system and the difference between Western and Indigenous perspectives, we're now going to discuss what it is like for these women that are working within our parks. As I'm speaking, I would like you all to reflect on these workplace challenges and see if any are familiar to your experiences. Or maybe they'll make you realize that your workplace might not be as inclusive and safe for all employees. So these aren't the only challenges that these women face, but these are based off the intersectionality of being Indigenous and a woman in these spaces. And due to time today, unfortunately, we're only going to cover half of them. But if you'd like more information, definitely reach out because I love talking about my research. So please reach out. So the first challenge we're going to talk about is alternative views. And if you might remember at the beginning, I said that these challenges are modern days of frontier violence. So underneath the title, I have the type of frontier violence that this challenge actually is. So this one would be assimilation and control. Protected areas are a method of forceful assimilation, and modern conservation really continues this legacy. Parks continue to call Indigenous people prehistoric, which is a modern way that park systems continually justify the claiming of unceded territory, even when there are members of the removed communities within their park workforce. This erasure also plays out in our modern education systems. So, Indigenous focused coursework is required in 0% of American park management majors and only 6% of the natural resource management majors. What is the result of this? Is widespread invisibility of Indigenous peoples, history, and issues in resource management. Settler colonialism is not just a piece of history, its structures are enduring and built into the frameworks of our systems. This is problematic when these students graduate without any understanding of the actual history of the lands and resources they are going to manage throughout their careers. So within this study, when one of the participants tried to incorporate local Indigenous history into her programming, her leadership team gave her a textbook from the 1960s written by white anthropologists and told her she could only use information she found within. This mindset really maintains the Eurocentric worldview. So as this participant, you can see the quote on the screen, said, yeah, so it's just like a huge emotional burden, especially when you're faced with people who don't see your viewpoint, don't want to see your viewpoint. And just with this park, the Park Service, it's just been so dominated by Euro-American pioneers, explorers, and discoverers. Like the narrative has just been pushed forward for the past 100 years, and even that is challenging to overcome. The Indigenous women park rangers in these spaces feel like they are living within an alternative reality of truths and historical views, creating intense emotional burden and burnout. And I'm not sure if you all saw the news this weekend, but currently in our parks, park visitors are being asked to report any signage in the parks that are negative about either past or living Americans, which is just our current administration trying to create more alternative views to our history. And yeah, I'm baffled by this, but the positive for me is that this administration is enriching my data set by the day. Okay, next is weird white people questions. So, of convincing the park system and coworkers that Indigenous people and their voices are still present in the land wasn't challenging enough, the participants also have to face the general public. They said that sometimes it feels like they are animals in a zoo or a circus, or like they are in a reenactment of history instead of being a part of modern society. Many spoke of having to justify that they are just as Indigenous as their ancestors. I'm not going to read through these questions because there's a lot of them here, but just you'll read through them and you'll just see kind of how egregious some of the questions are that these modern women are facing. They talked a lot about how interfacing with the general public on a daily basis has a good indicator for the understanding of Indigenous peoples and issues currently across the United States. So one participant mentioned, is this really what the rest of America is thinking? Is this really what the rest of the world is being fed? They are looking at ideas that we don't exist anymore. Who are we if we don't have this as a part of our history? And although these situations are challenging, the women continue to do their work and face the bombardment of inappropriate questions. Because, as one participant said, I worry about when I leave, if there are no natives here, what are they going to be talking about? Another participant realizes that these visitors might never get the chance to hear someone from her tribe ever speak again, so she uses the opportunity to share her history and cultural knowledge. Next, we're going to talk about trust responsibility with tribes. So, the trust responsibility is a legal and moral obligation of the U.S. federal government to protect tribal sovereignty, lands, assets, and resources, as well as to uphold treaty obligations to tribal nations. It is recognized via the U.S. Constitution and the Supreme Court rulings, and over time has been reaffirmed through acts of Congress. The key responsibilities of the trust responsibility are to protect tribal lands and natural resources, uphold treaty obligations, provide essential services, and support tribal self governance. Despite these legal obligations, the U.S. has frequently failed to uphold its trust responsibilities. In natural resource management, this includes broken treaties, land theft, misappropriation of tribal funds, and trust assets leading to resource mismanagement. Trust responsibility obligations include reservation lands, but also large tracts of land under the control of the U.S. government. Lands in which federal agencies constantly make management decisions with no input from the tribes they impact. When the women in this study spoke about trust responsibility and bringing it up to the Park Service, they were told things like their people are just trying to get something for nothing, which of course perpetuates the stereotype that Native people are lazy, have been given everything, and haven't had to work. As you can imagine, having to fight for rights that are represented in the US Constitution makes these women feel angry and frustrated. Racial profiling by park law enforcement. Park Service law enforcement often profile Indigenous peoples, leading to the excessive use of force against them, criminalizing cultural practice and undermining traditional ways of life. This really started with the founding of our parks and continues today in a modern form. So, we're going to talk about numerous examples where preservationist values within the national parks have really overruled Indigenous and cultural practices and rights, often under the justification of protecting the pristine wilderness. So, in Yellowstone National Park in 1872, the military forcibly removed multiple tribes from their homelands, banned bison hunting, controlled burning, and seasonal movements, which of course then made the bison population plummet. In Yosemite National Park in 1890, the U.S. Army removed indigenous tribes from the land, banning cultural burning, and promoted this idea of the pristine wilderness. As we all know, now Yosemite faces severe risk of wildfire due to the dense forest cover. In Mesa Verde National Park in 1906, the park was classified their cliff dwellings as archaeological ruins instead of living cultural sites. They also prevented tribes from conducting ceremonies at sites and criminalized other cultural practice within the park boundaries. This reinforces the idea that Native people are of the past. In Badlands National Park in 1942, the U.S. government took 125,000 acres of Lakota lands to create the Badland bombing range. After the war, the government returned a small portion of the lands that remained contaminated. A section of the stolen land was named Badland National Park and still excludes tribal practice. Now, this profiling continues today with limiting cultural practice and harvest from protected areas and landscapes, but it also plays out more directly. So, one participant spoke about having to drive her own car to work, knowing that the park police discriminated against Indigenous and other people of color. She made sure her park ranger hat was on the dashboard and her radio was clearly visible in the seat. She felt the need to justify her presence in the space to protect her safety. As she noted, I have to make sure that I look like I work here. I have to be able to prove I work here. Like it, that was horrible. Next challenge is white women managers. So, white women managers often perpetuate covert discrimination, particularly when they weaponize whiteness by using their race to innocence to frame the indigenous experience through a lens that centers their own narrative. This topic always actually pains me to discuss, and every time it got brought up in the interviews, I just kind of put my hands in my face because I feel very passionately about women in leadership, but white women really must do better. That being said, males were also complained about, but their discrimination is more overt. So you really know where you stand. With women, we're much more covert in our discriminatory behavior, and it all just hurts more because women expect women to want to support each other, especially within very male-dominated workplaces. So, from their white women managers, participants were told things like, "Stop acting on your emotions. I know it is like to be a woman in this field, so calm down." This is an example of race to innocence, which is comparing your experience with another's, and that you cannot be a part of the discrimination due to your own discrimination. Now, it's important to understand here that gender discrimination is not the same as ethnic discrimination or cultural genocide. I want to talk about the quote I have on the screen here. This came from participant two, and she had a particularly problematic white woman manager. And as you'll see, this example is actually a crossover also with the alternative views. This participant had hiring authority for her park, and she had recently returned from a diversity training where it was discussed that their park system staff comprised of a 90% white people and the majority male. She had focused her efforts as a manager on hiring a more diverse staff and was an outlier within her system. She was told by her supervisor that she needed to hire more white rangers onto her team in order to make her team a better representation of the rest of the nation. The supervisor stated, "Most of the United States has white people, so you need to hire more white people, maybe white men." I don't know about you all, but I've literally never been in a situation where having more white men involved would have made it better. So this one always just I don't, it doesn't matter how many times I read it or say it, it just always will shock me. Now, of course, working in these repeated and significant challenges create a really unhealthy workplace. And these women spoke to their emotional burnout, depression, feeling overworked due to their cultural emotional load, and teaching visitors and coworkers, feeling like their identity is being compromised, which isn't good for their soul. Many of them spoke to wanting to walk away from their job, but not their lands. And yet, these women persist and they are endlessly resilient. As this participant mentioned, the common question I get is, how do you work for an agency that took the land of your people and destroyed your people? And my response is usually, but you don't get that story that I'm telling you from anyone else. We're still here and you need to know that. And also, yeah, it sucked and it was terrible, but we're still here. And sharing that story to people from all around the world is like no other feeling I've ever had. So, how can we support healthy workplaces? Hopefully, as I've been talking, you've been able to identify some of the structural issues that might be present in your workplaces, because once they are identified, we can all work to change them. So here are the top supports for healing that the women in this study mentioned. The first one is having non-native peers recognize racial harassment and moments of discrimination. So we can all do this for our coworkers, and many of the participants just kept bringing this up, how helpful it was when their white peers would call their leadership team out, or even just go up to them and say, "Hey, I just saw that happen, and that was really not okay. I'm really sorry that happened to you." The next is mentoring. This comes up time and time again in the research, and having a supportive network, direct mentoring are both extremely powerful tools to help women navigate the workplace. Having other Indigenous coworkers so that they don't feel culturally alone, connecting with tribal traditions and feeling supported by their own Native communities, teaching from the elders and traditional ecological knowledge, and then, of course, we're all park rangers, so spending time in nature is one of the top things that we do for our healing. Next, I want to talk about changing the structure. And so, how can we all work to help change the structure within our workplaces? First and foremost, don't be the problematic white woman manager. Check your own biases and check your own behaviors. Just be really reflective in how you manage people. Hiring more Native people, representation really matters in the workplace. But of course, coming along with hiring, we also need to make sure we're creating safe spaces for these people to be. So, what I would challenge you to do is focus on workplace readiness instead of worker readiness. Think about if your workplace is suitable for the employee, not the other way around. Think about, do you have support systems in place to maintain cultural safety? Do you understand the experiences of Native employees? I'm often asked how you go about doing this, and the simplest answer is just to ask. But if you're going to ask the question, you must also be prepared to listen, to not make excuses, and be committed to making the changes. Focus on sustainable career development. This is especially important for women with caretaking responsibilities. If you support these women with achievable career paths, it will greatly increase retention rates, which of course links back to the power of mentoring. Cultural education opportunities for tribal youth. Many of the women actually mentioned this, and to bring the young people into the workplace to help connect them to the landscapes. Making cultural sensitivity training mandatory. This was brought up especially for upper leadership, because oftentimes workplaces really focus on new or seasonal employees, and the upper leadership team is exempt from these trainings. So don't assume that because someone has been with the organization for a long time that they aren't problematic. It's also helpful to recognize identity strain and educate non-native staff on how to interact in a more culturally appropriate way. And then the last one is changing problematic place names or discriminatory titles or language in practice. So, a good example of this is using the term chief within your leadership structure. It's 2025 and probably time for that term to be examined and changed within all teams. Okay, that was a whirlwind of my data. There's so much more to share with you, and it was really hard to kind of limit it down. But I just want to talk about, so what? Like, what does this data matter? Why does this study matter? And especially because there's such an underrepresentation of Native women in these fields. But I would like to remind everybody that Indigenous people comprise only 5% of the global population, but manage 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. So we are the knowledge keepers, and the Native women especially. We bring a wealth of unique knowledge and experiences to these workplaces. Our inclusion has been shown to improve conservation outcomes. Indigenous women in the workforce enrich organizations by bringing diverse perspectives, unique skills, valuable knowledge, and a powerful commitment to community-centered justice and sustainability. It has been shown that Indigenous women are the moral guardians of society, and when supported, we will be the ones to lead positive social change throughout our communities. Thank you for sharing this space with me, and I will turn it back over to Sarah to continue the program.
Oh my goodness, let's give Carly a big round of applause, a virtual round of applause. That was fantastic, Carly. Thank you so much for sharing your research and your findings. I mean, this is exactly why we're meeting here today, and everything that you're discovering in your work is, I think, going to be really monumental in creating better places. And we're just so thrilled to have you here today. And